Okay, first of all, thank you all for being here this evening. Just a short story about myself. I grew up in the countryside, so nature and wildlife is something that's always been a part of my life. And as I've grown older and moved increasingly into more urban settings, I've become more aware of the connections and oftentimes tensions between humans and everything else that we share this planet with. So back in September, before the beginning of my final year here at RCA on the Service Design programme, I thought it would be worth seeing if there might be other people in our community of artists and designers who are also interested in exploring the breadth, depth and complexity of these interconnected themes in our work. And so with the support of the Student Union, SustainLab RCA was set up and launched at the beginning of this academic year with the aim to do two key things. Our first intention has been to give a platform to students across the college to share their ideas and work in order to open critical and reflective debate about what that often overused term sustainability might actually mean for us as designers in our current environmental, social, political and economic climate. And we've been doing this through our regular Petra Future evening in the bar, which some of you have presented and been at, with students and alumni sharing their work across the various programmes, from product design, innovation design, engineering and service design, to textiles, visual communications and experience design. And we also shared this discourse in an exhibition earlier this year in the entrance foyer, which you might have seen. It coincided with the Green Week run by the Students' Union. And importantly, our intention has really been to highlight that this is an ever-evolving conversation, not just something that's definitive, final or confined to one particular discipline or a project brief. This objective is also complementary to work that's already happening across the college as well, which can be seen upstairs in the whole of the show. And there was also a lecture last night where fellow service design students explained how their work was addressing the complexity of the issues that we face as designers. And our second intention within SustainLab has been to explore ways in which we might embed this kind of culture more critically of conscious design into our community and environment here at RCA as practicing designers, rather than it just being a separate conversation or an optional project brief. So we've done this by starting conversations with other areas of the college, like the cafe and canteen, with the architects of the new terrace space upstairs, and the Buildings and Estates Department. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to extend our thanks to the people and departments who've supported us this year, particularly the Students' Union, Jazbo, Benji, Whiskey and Tox, for their support throughout the year, and obviously the Service Design Department led by Nick for their kind support with this particular event. So, to this evening, we're really excited to welcome two very influential speakers to the Royal College of Art. We have Kate Raworth from the field of economics, who will deliver her lecture on donut economics, and then John Thackara from the field of design and culture and cultural research will open up the conversation after the lecture and also invite your questions. Now Kate, I first heard give her lecture at LSE back in November, and I just thought she had to come and speak to designers. She was so inspiring. She describes herself as a renegade economist, focused on exploring the economic mindset needed to address the 21st century's social and ecological challenges. Her internationally acclaimed idea of donut economics has been widely influential among sustainable development thinkers, progressive businesses, and political activists, from the UN General Assembly to the Occupy movement. And it was published last year in her book, Donut Economics, 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist, which is also available on loan in the library. And John Thackara, he studied philosophy and trained as a journalist before working for 10 years as a book and magazine editor. He's a senior fellow of the Royal College of Art here in London and a fellow of the Musashino Art University in Japan. And he's also a member of the UK's Parliament Standing Commission on Design. John's been travelling the world for over 30 years in search of stories about the practical steps taken by communities to realise a sustainable future. He writes about these stories online in his blog, Doors of Perception, and in several books that have been published. He uses them also in talks for cities and businesses, and he organises festivals and events himself that bring the subjects of these stories together. So now, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Kate Raworth to the stage.
Thank you very much, Becky, and thank you. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Thank you to Becky and the SustainLab team and all the faculty here at the RCA. It's a complete honour. And of course, I'm very lucky to come here this week. I've been wandering around the exhibition So impressed and amused and made curious by the diverse things I've seen. I saw the marriage umbrellas for blind spots in China and the refugee Monopoly set. I thought it was fantastic. I really want a VSM swimsuit top because I was doing breaststroke this morning thinking, I know I can improve this. And I know the VSM thing would immediately tell me what I need to do differently. Then I wandered through the department for seaweed. I love that. Came to the Seaguard drone, which I thought was brilliant. And the puffer fish that puffs up when you have a bias. And then I was reminded never to use big fluffed up fluffy buzzwords, so I'm going to be very careful with my vocabulary. But of course I saw many other things between all these, and it's a real privilege to be here because you folks know something through your education that I took a very long time to realize, that it's all about design, and that will become obvious to you as I talk. So let me just ask a question. I want to figure out who's here. Put your hand up if you've ever studied economics in any form, A-level. Okay, great. Put your hand up if you've never studied economics. You can't believe you've come to a talk with the word economics in the title. Oh, equal numbers, brilliant. Some people put their hands up twice. I'm going to make it worth it for everybody. I will tell you why I'm here. And I'm standing here because I don't like standing behind things, but I'm going to just stand here so I can see this screen. Right. I'm here because I was a teenager of the 1980s, so like a couple, but not very many people in this room. I grew up seeing a hole appear in the ozone layer, a famine in Ethiopia. I remember the first time on the TV news them saying that there's something called the greenhouse gas effect. And I remember the Exxon Valdez oil tanker spewing out oil into Alaska's pristine waters. And so by the end of the 80s, I just knew one thing: I wanted to help change the world. Now, if I'd been really smart, I probably would have come to design school. But I didn't think that. I thought, I need to learn the language of public policy. I need to learn economics. And then I'll know this language of policy and power, and I'll be able to make a difference. So this is me, age 18, excitedly reading my first economics textbook, skipping off to university, thinking I was about to learn it all. But I was really then frustrated by what I was taught over the next 4 years, because I felt that the theories I was taught pushed to the margins, to the fringes, the issues I cared most about, like environmental integrity, like social justice. You had to hunt them down, do a special paper in that if that's what you wanted to do. So after 4 years of academic study of economics, I decided instead not to go further into the academia of it, but to immerse myself in the real world economy. I spent 3 years working in the villages of Zanzibar with micro-entrepreneurs. Actually, this is the time in my life I got closest to design. I was in Zanzibar as an economist thinking, what the heck difference can I make here? And I realized if I learned the language, I could be half local. I knew the language, I knew the materials that people were using, making crafts, and I was half Mzungu, half tourist, and I had the eyes of a tourist but the knowledge of a local. And I was helping local craftspeople slightly tweak and change their design so that they could actually tap into the massive tourist market that was flooding their country, and they could get something out of this tourism. It was, of course, the best 3 years of my working life. I then spent 4 years at the United Nations, working on the Human Development Report, which reimagines development from economic development to human development, part of that reconceptualization. And then I spent a decade working with Oxfam, campaigning on workers' rights in global supply chains, on showing that climate change is an issue of social injustice. And then I became a mother of twins. And this piece of design, this double-seated bike, was my greatest liberation. The day my children turned 1, I was legally allowed to put helmets on. That was actually the day they turned 1. I was the happiest woman, and I started to understand gender, technology, and design in a way that nothing had come close before. But this was by now 20 years of my career. And I look back, and yes, every career story is one level, just a series of bad haircuts. But you laugh, you have your own photos, or you will by the time you reach my age. But it's also a story of what you were searching for. And I realized I'd spent about the first 20 years of my working life trying to make visible the things that are left invisible in mainstream economics. The unpaid caring work of women, the impacts of climate change, workers' rights and exploitation down global supply chains. And I just thought, I don't want to spend the rest of my career trying to make these things visible from the sidelines. I want to be part of a movement that I think is happening, because this was in 2009, post-financial crash. I want to be part of a movement that's rewriting economics, not just rewriting it in the light of a financial crisis, but in the light of a crisis of inequality and of climate change and ecological degradation. And so I left Oxfam in order to write the book Doughnut Economics. I now teach at the Environmental Change Institute in Oxford, but I essentially immersed myself in all the economics I had never been taught. Feminist, complexity, ecological, institutional, behavioral economics. And I asked myself what happens when these start to dance on the same page. And that's what came out in my book. Now, economics professors will say, oh, you do protest too much, you know, this is a straw man case you put forward of the old syllabus. So I like to offer them a little challenge. I say, show me the first picture you teach. Show me the biggest picture you have of the economy, and show me how you depict humanity. And it pretty much comes out the same. Let me ask those in the room, what's the first picture you remember learning in economics? Yeah, same the world over, supply and demand. As if to say, day one, welcome to economics. Here's supply and demand, this is the market. As if the economy is the market and the market's in equilibrium. Well, after 2008, we know that's not true. I don't think it's a very good place to start a degree, but it is the place where almost every economics degree in the world begins. What about the biggest picture of an economy? I asked them to show me the biggest picture you have of the economy and its actors, and it's this diagram. It's called the circular flow diagram. So that circular bit there between households and business, that's the essential market relationship, where households provide their labor and capital. In return, they get wages and profit. And with that money, they can do consumer spending and buy goods and services. And so the resources go round and round, and so does the money. And yes, there are some leakages through banks, through government, through trade, but that comes back in. What you can see there is a depiction of the economy as essentially closed, self-contained, circular, sealed. And it's full of silences, because this is still the biggest diagram. It was first drawn about 70 years ago. In fact, exactly 70 years ago this year, in 1948. But it's still the biggest diagram used of the economy. And the blank spaces there are extraordinary. This diagram makes absolutely no mention of the living world, of the energy and the matter and materials that are drawn continually into the economy. Look at them all around us now. That's everything we have is made of matter and energy. It's missing and spewed out as waste and pollution. It makes no mention of the unpaid caring work, particularly of women, all that cooking, washing and cleaning and sweeping, raising the children that goes into making labor fresh and ready for work every day. And it makes no mention of the commons, the place where people come together, not through the market or the state, but as a community and co-create goods and services they value. And these, the living world, unpaid care, and the commons are three of the most fundamental sources of our well-being. And if the biggest picture of the economy that is taught in 2018 is silent on them, it does not serve us well for the future. What about the picture of humanity, our selfie? Well, the character of humanity put at the heart of economic theory is rational economic man. He never actually gets drawn in the textbooks, but since I learned the power of pictures in the process of my education, I decided to draw him. So he'd have to be a man, standing alone. He's got money in his hand, ego in his heart, a calculator in his head, and nature at his feet. And he hates work, he loves luxury, and he knows the price of everything. And the really worrying thing about this character is not just how absurdly narrow a depiction of us he is, it's what looking at him does to us. Because this is the most fascinating research in my mind. On being told that he is like us, we actually become more like him. Economic students, as they go through year 1 to year 2 to year 3 of their studies, over time say that they more value competition and self-interest as traits over altruism and collaboration. So who we tell ourselves we are shapes who we become, which creates an extraordinary obligation for any academic discipline, or indeed any designer who claims to tell us who we are, because the model changes us, we respond to it. Add to this the challenge that back in the 1870s, economists of the day like William Stanley Jevons and Leon Walras in Switzerland wanted to show that economics was a science, to give it a really legitimate footing. So they looked to the science great of the day, Sir Isaac Newton, who had made himself famous for time immemorial because he discovered the laws of motion, the physical laws of motion. I think they set off unwittingly to discover the economic laws of motion. If we could show that economics mimics physics and has laws of motion, then we will actually establish it as a science. And from the 1950s, when international data started to become available, I think that's what started happening. A deep, deep, deep Freudian connection and a longing to be like Newton, said economists trying to find these laws of motion. And the first one, well, these three have told us extraordinary stories that have shaped the politics of our lives for decades. First one is on inequality. Simon Kuznets in the 1950s had a little bit of data on Germany, the US and UK about what happens to inequality over time in a country. And he plotted it on a page and he said, I think I see a pattern, that as an economy gets richer, first inequality may increase, but then it decreases. And he couldn't understand it. But this is what the data showed. He even said, I have 5% empirical information, 95% speculation, and probably some wishful thinking. Those are his words. But by the time he'd drawn this graph on the page, as you know, images take on a life of their own. They sneak their way into the backs of our heads and sit in the visual cortex without us knowing that they're there, but they deeply shape what we see and what we don't see in the way we think. And this image itself whispered out a secret mantra, which is, if you care about inequality, don't try to redistribute. That's socialist. And you might actually slow down growth. And growth, it's growth that will even things up again. When Thomas Piketty came along in 2014 with his doorstopper of a book, Capital, I'll tell you the key message. Piketty looked back at this data and he said, Kuznets was right. This is what his data showed. But he was measuring at a particular moment in time, pre-war and post-war. And it's war that destroys the capital of the wealthy. And after the wars, governments invested in health, education, and housing. So you had massive government redistributional spending and war destroying the capital of wealthy. It was war and government intervention that bent that curve down, not the inherent workings of the market. But that curve lives on in policymakers' mind. We hear it in austerity economics. We hear it in trickle-down economics. Pictures are deeply powerful, and they have a long tail of influence, because today's politicians were at university decades ago. Any economist in university today will tell you that curve does not hold, but its tail of influence goes on. In the 1990s, another diagram came along in relation to pollution. So unimaginative were they called it just the environmental Kuznets curve, because it had the same shape. But the idea was, looking at local air and water pollutants, there seems to be a pattern that as there's a lady in the head in the audience shaking her head, I love it. As the economy grows, first pollution increases, but don't worry, don't intervene. You'll slow down growth if you try and regulate. Don't intervene, because like a well-trained child, growth will clean up after itself. Except anyone in the room with children knows this probably won't happen. Because they were looking only at local air and water pollutants. When you take account of global pollutants, of greenhouse gases, of material footprints, this curve does not automatically bend down. But the idea that growth will clean up again after itself becomes a policy mantra of grow now, clean up later. And we've seen many countries pursue this. But these two were a wonderful underpinning for the deepest belief, which is that growth is and can be endless. Simon Kuznets himself, poor guy, because he was brilliant, in the 1930s was asked by US Congress to come up with a single measure of the economy. He did. It's what we now call GDP or national income. And as he created it, he said, but this could scarcely be taken as a measure of welfare of a nation, because it misses out the unpaid care of parents, it misses out the value created by the community, and it's just a flow measure of goods and services sold. It doesn't tell you what's happening to the stocks that are getting transformed. But this was such a tempting thing, a single number, that those caveats were put aside. And a horse race began between the US and the USSR. And still today, even in the richest of countries, governments will tell you, I've just been from the UK to Finland to Denmark to Germany to Spain to Italy, every of the richest countries in the world, the solution to government's woes lies in more growth. We have economies that have become addicted to endless growth by their very design. Well, you can complain a lot, and people have critiqued this for years, but I'm so inspired by Buckminster Fuller's approach. You never change things by fighting the existing reality, or merely by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And I think that's true. Sometimes the best form of protest is to propose something new. And that's where I wanted to focus my energy. So I stand with those who chain themselves to oil rigs, who oppose fracking in Preston, who expose corruption in the Panama Papers. But it's not enough to protest. You have to show alternatives that actually are emerging, that are already happening, to create that positive new future. So I want to start with a question that I was never invited to ask in all my 4 years of studying economics. which is, what is the economy for? The question of purpose. Because if you don't know what it's for, you have no idea of how to judge whether or not you're making progress and what success looks like. And so for this question of progress and purpose, I want to offer you the only donut that actually turns out to be any good for us. So let me explain what's going on here. Imagine humanity's use of resources radiating out from the center of this picture, so that the hole in the middle is a place where people are left falling short on the essentials of life, without the food, healthcare, education, housing, energy, income, political voice, and all the essentials that people have a claim to lead lives of dignity and opportunity. And these are crowdsourced from the Sustainable Development Goals, so the world's governments have already agreed that every person in the world has a claim to these. We want no one left falling short of resources in that hole, but over the social foundation and into the green donut itself. But, and this is a big but, our collective use of resources cannot overshoot the outer ring, that ecological ceiling, because there we put so much pressure on this unique, dynamically balanced living planet that we begin to kick her systems out of kilter, and we cause climate breakdown, we acidify the oceans, create a hole in the ozone layer, catastrophic collapse of ecosystems. And these around the outside are known as the 9 planetary boundaries, the 9 life-supporting systems drawn up almost a decade ago by Earth system scientists who believe it's these that keep Earth in the beautifully balanced home sweet home state she's been in for the last 11,000 years, that makes this planet so hospitable for humanity. So put those two together, the challenge is to meet the needs of all people within the means of the planet. And already the shape of progress seems to have changed. It's not this ever-rising line of growth, it's balance. It's got a very different feel. But if I tell you that's a compass for the 21st century, well, where are we now? And that's not an easy picture to look at, because all of that red shows you in the center either the extent to which we're falling short, say for food, for there, if you can see food at the top, that little red wedge goes 11% of the way to the middle, because 11% of people worldwide don't have enough food to eat every day. On water next to it, there's 2 indicators. 9% of people don't have access to clean water. 1 person in 3 worldwide doesn't have access to what we call a toilet. But you can see on every one of those social dimensions, there are people, millions or billions, falling short, and they live in countries rich and poor. But at the same time as that shortfall, we've already overshot at least 4 of these planetary boundaries on climate change, on excessive fertilizer use with nitrogen and phosphorus, on biodiversity loss and the death of species, and on land conversion, too much of Earth's surface turned for human use. So I think actually this really is our selfie, humanity's selfie, our collective one, at the beginning of the 21st century. And we're the first generation to see it. Last century's economists never saw this. Why would we think their theories were up to taking on its challenges? Last century's politicians and business leaders never saw this. So why would we think that their politics and their business models were up for its challenges? And of course, last century's designers never saw this. So why would we think that last century's designs in any way were equipped to help humanity turn this story around and start, for the first time in human history, meeting the needs of all people while coming back within the means of the planet? We've never even tried to do this before. Well, I think if we're going to do this, we need a new starting point for economics. And as you'll have gathered, for me, economics is told in pictures. You know this. It took me 25 years to figure this out. You know this from day one. If you're in design and the first tool of your art is a pencil and drawing. But it's taken me so long to realize the power of images, both in depicting a compass for humanity, but also the pictures that are drawn and taught in economics that shape our worldview, what we see and what we don't see, what's central, what's marginal. So I wanted to rewrite economics by redrawing its most prized pictures. So I start with a new diagram of the economy. I call this the embedded economy diagram. You've got the economy embedded in society and all social, cultural, political institutions, embedded in the living world, drawing in matter and material, spewing out waste and pollution, and bathed in a river of solar energy. But even look inside the economy, it's not just the market, the old supply and demand, and the state. It's also got the household, that place of unpaid caring work where we all begin every day. And of course, the irony is that when you're a student, it's actually the moment in life when you're plucked from the household and you live in an institutional hall with a canteen. It's actually the moment hardest to appreciate the amount of time that the household consumes for parents. But it's essential. And the commons, that place where we co-organize, co-create, co-value in cooperatives, associations, things that communities value, like a street garden or Wikipedia on the web, often without money changing hands. Finance, I've drawn it in the middle there because it should be a flow in service to the functioning of that economy. They used to call finance financial services, which now sounds quite ironic because it seems to come only to serve itself. But what would it look like to redesign the financial system that was actually in service to the functioning of those forms of economic provisioning, in service to human well-being? And as for rational economic man, we're so much more interesting than that. Yes, we can be self-interested, but we're also socially reciprocating. We don't have fixed preferences, as the character tells us. Actually, we have fluid values. If I gave a survey to everybody in this room to fill in about your values and preferences, but for this half of the room, the front page said this is a consumer reaction study, and the other half of the room, it said this is a citizen reaction study, research shows you're going to fill it in differently because I've activated the consumer and activated the citizen, and even the very words by which we're called change how we respond. We're that fluid. I think we're not work-hating, we're actually purpose-seeking. And those are the lucky ones for whom work and purpose come together. And far from being dominant over nature, the peak of nature's pyramid, we are, of course, embedded in the web of life and deeply dependent upon the rest of that web for our well-being. So let me pull out of the economics and see how these ideas can be taken into different fields, because what's really delighted me over the last, particularly the last year, but over the last 5 years since I first drew the donut, is the different communities who have picked it up and actually brought it into their practice, from cities, city design, to businesses, to finance, to teachers. And I want to ask the question, how can design help bring humanity into the donut? I think the biggest realization I made was that economics had got lost trying to find these laws of motion to mimic physics. Actually, it was just the wrong kind of physics. If you jump into 21st century physics, which is about complexity, you realize that the economy is a complex adaptive system. You can't control it. You can steward it. You can help shape it. And to shape it, you can think of design features that you want to bring alive in. So for me, design, halfway through writing my book, Design, it was just like, I was like Archimedes running through the streets going, it's all about design! Which is why I'm so pleased to be here, because you figured that out before me. So how can design help bring humanity into the donut? I'm thinking about economic design. And I put 2 design principles at the heart of my book. Don't wait for growth to even things up, because it won't. The richest countries in the world actually are more unequal today than they have been in the last 30 years, and 82 billionaires own more wealth than the poorest half of the world's population. We need to create economies that are distributive by design, not waiting for growth to even things up. And don't wait for growth to clean up after itself, because it won't. We have extraordinarily high ecological and carbon and nitrogen and land and water footprints in the world's richest countries. We need to create economies that are regenerative by design. Let me talk a bit about what I mean by each of those. So through the middle of this diagram runs the degenerative linear 20th century industrial economy. Take Earth's materials, make them into stuff we want, use it for a while, and throw it away. And of course that cuts against the cycles of the living world, so we need to bend those arrows around, ensuring that resources are used again and again, separating the biological, which nature has always done. She breaks things down and back into carbon or chitin or lichen or basic building blocks, and makes things again and again. And technical materials, from this clicker to most of the synthetic technical human-made materials in this room. And of course this is the circular economy, the cyclical economy, the cradle-to-cradle economy. The way I express it is that we need an economy that works with and within the cycles of the living world. So the first thing we have to do is understand the cycles of the living world, and then figure out how we can design so that we re-inhabit ourselves as a participant in Earth's cycles. And then the second way is thinking about distributive design. I think very simply, many technologies and institutions of the 20th century were dominated by centralized design. And in the 21st century, we have the opportunity to use technologies and create institutions that are distributive by design. Think energy. 20th century energy, an oil rig, a coal mine, a gas pipeline. 21st century energy, solar panels dotted across the roofs of every housetop. Think communications, 20th century, an operator connecting wires, who may I put you through to, and connecting you through the central. 21st century, you've all got a network node in your pockets. It is the platform, the internet. So can we create institutions too? 20th century business, the shareholder-owned corporation. Bring masses of capital together, everybody owns one little bit, and that becomes a very, very powerful, large entity that pays out dividends to its shareholders. 21st century, Many of our technologies are distributed small-scale manufacturing. We don't need to bring such large pieces of capital together in one place. You can create smaller, more nimble, employee, cooperatively owned, small-scale enterprise, totally different opportunities. So let me just give you some examples of places where these ideas and the donut have been put into practice, which delights me. I was contacted by urban designers in Stockholm who are designing a new suburb of Stockholm. You see here there's this road, and then under the road there's an area of land that's been long slated to be a new suburb. There's a train station right there that's never been opened. So they're going to turn this into a new suburb. And they contacted me about Twitter and just said, oh, here's our design table. We've got your donut on the table. Because we're using it as an aspirational blueprint to ask, what would it look like to design a suburb here in Stockholm that meets the needs, all the needs of its inhabitants, but does so within the means of the planet, respecting the ecosystem and its functioning into which we're building. And they even said, we're going to call it a donut district. Of course, I thought, what have I done? So I've been in touch with them and met with them, and it's fascinating because, of course, no one quite knows what this looks like. What is a donut district that is one of the world's most inhabitable, sustainable living districts? Well, they've come up with an idea that they need a more snappy name, if you can think of one. It's called a 200 by 200 by 200 district. That's asking for something else, isn't it? Where each house in this district should be at most 200 meters from a mobility hub. So the most obvious thing to do is to just go 200 meters down the road, to jump on a tram or a bus or a cargo bike instead of having a car. 200 meters from green space. And 200 meters from the urban amenities like the health center, the school, the theater, the community center, so that it just becomes common sense to go on foot, go on bike, go on tram, go on the train, and to feel like it's a great place to live. And they've only just very recently come up with these design plans. You can see there's one for the local amenities and mobility. I think of that as sort of meeting the needs of all. If you were to go around the inner circle of the donut, that's trying to plot those. And then underneath, within the means of the planet, building in circular economy from the beginning, building in ecosystem services. So those orangey arrows that run through those are pollinator pathways throughout the community with green roofs in the buildings to ensure that the ecosystem functioning is retained. That's an idea from urban design. But what has really fascinated me is working with companies. And this is just a Photoshop image, but I've shown it to so many companies that get excited and say, what would it be like? Oh, look, there just happens to be an empty can of Coke here. Right? I mean, imagine if Coke put their product at the middle of that table and asked themselves, how does the way that we make our product, not the nice philanthropy on the side, I'm not talking about that, I'm talking about core business model, the can, the paints, the Coke, the water, the marketing, how does our core business model and product affect humanity's ability to live in the donut? Is the way we're doing business, lovely little piece of political history behind this story, is the way we're doing business helping to bring humanity into the donut to meet the needs of all people and come back within the means of the planet? Or let's be honest, because it kind of was the 20th century story that the way we do business is actually by pushing people out, paying often exploitative wages, sacking women when they're pregnant, and taking communities' water sources, I'm looking at you, Coke, while pushing us over planetary boundaries. So what kind of business are you going to be? And I've had this conversation with many, many different companies, and it's been fascinating. Some will just say, well, I show them the donut, well, that's a sad picture, but the business of business is business. That was Milton Friedman in the 1970s. Everything we're doing is nearly legal, so we're just going to carry on until they find us or the cost of business exceeds it. And then other people I meet just say, oh my God, this donut diagram, this is like our logo. We set up an enterprise in order to sequester carbon, in order to meet health needs, in order to restore the nitrogen cycle. Oh my, this is who we are. This is why we're in business. Completely different mindsets. And I'm going to come back to that. So I want to give you some examples from different design that I think are examples of people putting these design principles into practice. Let's start with housing. And some of these may be familiar to you, which will be wonderful. The architect Alejandro Aravena in Chile and Argentina realized that in many communities, some people would just never be able to afford to buy a house, never have enough money. But he thought, well, maybe they could buy half a house. So he started building half houses with all the heating and water and electricity and the key rooms. And then when people had enough money saved up, maybe a decade later, they could fill the rest in. And his half houses are now being built because this is a successful way of making housing far more accessible to a group who thought they'd never own their own home. But here in Leeds, in the UK, here in Leeds, This is Lilac, which is low carbon impact community living. So you can see there's a lovely communal space. As a mother of 9-year-old kids, I would love to live there because I know my kids would thrive and they'd have friends and there'd be babysitters. So there's a commons already waiting to happen there. But there's, shared laundry, shared meeting space, shared guest rooms, communal co-housing. Very different designs from last century and indeed from the story that happens across London. Enterprise, here's a cooperative. This is a milk co-op in India, but here's a laundry employee-owned enterprise and cooperative in Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, where in the Rust Belt of America, where many big industries left because there was a lower wage rate overseas. The former workers then came back in and actually turned the industries into co-ops. Again, employee-owned enterprises, co-ops, these are the fastest growing forms of enterprise ownership in the UK. Distributed. Energy systems built into the roof of every house here in parts of Germany. A micro power station on the roof of every house. So the ownership of the capacity to generate electricity, that's totally unprecedented. This is a technology that's so on our side because the 21st century energy system looks like that. It is a distributed network from space. And here's a village in the north of India that never had any electricity access, and thanks to work from Greenpeace, now has solar panels and storage, totally equipped, showing that they could just jump the old system and jump into microgrids off the main grid. And then information, this is a makerspace or a fab lab. This one happens to be in the US. Community members can come and use open source design, Creative Commons licensing, 3D printers to be part of a global knowledge network. That one happens to be in the US, but this one is in Lomé in Togo, bringing ideas and the capacity to be part of a global network of idea sharing to a community far faster than the private sector is ever going to do it. So there are some examples of distributed by design. What about regenerative by design? I said 1/3 of people in the world don't have access to a toilet. Slums of Kenya are one place that used to not be the case. However, they do now because of Sanergy, which was set up by a group of MBA students who took a design challenge and looked at the Sustainable Development Goals and thought, how can we create a business that actually is in service to meeting humans' needs? They set up a franchise of micro toilets throughout the community, so creating micro enterprises for people who've never had access to an income, let alone their own business. The toilets are clean, so people have got toilet paper, soap, clean water for the first time. That brings dignity. It also brings health. The waste is collected every day and turned back into organic fertilizer for the fields, rebuilding the soil. So at the technical level, this is just closing the loop of the use of nutrients. But at the social level, it's distributive as well, creating enterprise throughout the community. This is a car created by Open Motors. If you buy one, it arrives like this, like a wardrobe from IKEA. If you know what you're doing, they say you can assemble it in under an hour. But the beautiful thing is if you don't know what you're doing, you can take it to somebody who does because it's open source. So the design of this chassis is open for anyone to see on the internet. It's 100% electric, it's 100% modular by design, so you can replace just one part. And then once you've got the basic chassis, it can be customized like this or like this in different ways around the world. So you've got an open source commons base, and then people are building niche businesses in different parts of the world. I live in Oxford. At the end of my road is the Mini Factory, where all the minis in the world are made and shipped out and sent all over the world full of air, which is kind of crazy. And actually, we should be shipping parts and assembling and refurbishing and remanufacturing and customizing and repairing in distributed manufacturing networks. And to me, this is the way of the future. And then this is Houdini, a Swedish sportswear company, who make all of their clothing either from wool and tencel, which are organic fibers, so they can be recomposted. In fact, what they did was get some ski wear that was wool and tencel, put it in a bin, turn it back into compost, grew some mushrooms on top, and served it to their customers and said, you're eating your old ski wear, which is a wonderful way of showing the connections to the living world. Or it's made from recycled polyester and recycled nylon. So they've got both of those loops of the circular economy going on. And Houdini, actually, if you're interested, were the first company to release just last month a planetary boundaries assessment of all 8 or 9 different textiles that they use, and they've assessed them against the planetary boundaries and the social foundations of the donut. So looking at their business through that lens. Now, Houdini are trying to make this circular loop, which is fantastic, but there's a real danger that we just leave the circular economy to merge business by business, and I just want to illustrate this. So imagine Houdini say, here's a bit of I always travel with hose pipe, it's so handy. Let's say, so 20th century economy was linear, right? Take Earth's materials, make them into stuff we want, use it for a while, throw it away. So we've got to bend that around and make the closed loop. So Houdini is saying, love your sportswear, and when you're finished with it, bring it back to us and we'll make it back into something new. So they're making the circular loop. Can I ask you to hold that? There we go. And then another company, I don't know, Mud Jeans in the Netherlands, they say, well, send us your jeans back and we'll make them back into jeans. Fantastic, these companies innovating. Can I ask you to hold that? Right? So now I want everybody in the room to imagine that the company that made the clothing, your jacket, your dress, your shirt, whatever is on your back, is asking you, just like these companies, to send it back to them. Can you make a little loop? Make a little loop? Yes, I do want you to do this. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, you look brilliant. Brilliant. Beautiful. Beautiful. But nature, of course, you can come down. Nature, of course, would laugh at us because nature does this. Right? Nature makes an ecosystem. She doesn't turn a peacock into a peacock and a daffodil into a daffodil. You can put those down. She makes an ecosystem. She turns things back into their basic building blocks of lignin and chitin and keratin, and then builds something new again. So no company alone can create this ecosystem. We need a level above, the level of the state, the level of the commons to help create the ecosystem. Otherwise we will be in these isolated little loops. And this is really a question that fascinates me. So what kind of future is going to happen for the circular economy? There is a real risk when individual businesses say, we'll do a bit of circular advantage. What kind of bits of the circular economy are actually quite good for our own business model, save us costs? We get what's called segmented circularity, which is what you all just did, where the material flows through closed loops, returns to brand, the standards are owned and protected by that company, the governance is in-house and the technology is proprietary. I'm not going to tell you how I made my recycled not polyester on nylon. That is a trademark. Or are we going to have ecosystem circularity, where the material flows in these nested loops like that ecosystem ball? It's returned not to the brand but to the ecosystem, where standards are open and shared in the Creative Commons, where governance is network-wide, pre-competitive, set by all companies. We'll use these 5 fibers or these 5 plastics, and where the technology is in a knowledge commons. It takes something more than individual companies to achieve that second ecosystem circularity. So how can economic design promote that? And let me just give you a few examples that I've seen in action that can help make that happen. One is city-scale planning. So this is from Glasgow. Amsterdam, London are also leading cities doing this, taking a city-wide scan of what are the material flows through our city. This is just a food scan of Glasgow. We've got meat, bread and beer, which I think is maybe a wonderful comment on the Glaswegian diet. But you can see they're looking at the loops that run between industries, starting to connect that ecosystem. We've got public procurement. I was in the Netherlands last week and I had a fantastic ride on Dutch State Railways with the woman who, due to her sheer conviction, not company policy, but and this is where most things start, the conviction of one person, I'm going to make this happen. Dutch State Railways now are run 100% on wind power. They ensured that new wind power was installed to match the demand and to be brought into the grid to match the demand of the railways. So, but you could have governments could say all the energy for our schools and buildings and public transport is going to run on renewable energy. That would massively boost the clean energy required to run a circular economy. Public provisioning in London, but in Bristol and cities around the world, realizing that shutting down, for example, drinking fountains led to the blight of the plastic bottle, and going back to almost the 1970s, like rediscovering the obvious, open up places. What's interesting this time around is not only just having a public provision of a water fountain, but actually the local city municipality working with places like Pret a Manger or all sorts of retailers saying, would you put a sticker on the door saying, we allow you to come and refill your bottle. So it's a kind of public-private interaction. Again, look back to the economy, it's the market, the state, the household and the commons. That's a market and state with a transformation in the commons culture that I refill, I don't buy a bottle. And then the last one, community initiatives, and I think this is where the exciting stuff is. I want to be in that room with those people. This is a repair cafe where you take your broken laptop, phone, clicker, and volunteers and folks are there who will help you repair it and show you how to repair it. It's not done off in secret. They'll show you how to repair it or tell you, actually, you need to take this to an expert and here's someone you could take it to. So repair cafes popping up. So that over here is reusing resources, but here we're just cutting resource use, fewer bottles and repairing and reusing. But I want to come back to think about the network as well, because in the same way, we've got digital networks, but they could also go off and have been going off in really the wrong direction. our wonderful online digital network that we call the internet has become dominated by corporate networks. Alphabet, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, Apple. They get taken up because of their size, because of their financial power. Their design is actually driven by finance. How many consumer hours of attention can you capture for the advertiser? Their governance is proprietary, the data gets captured, and that's obviously what's become highly scandalous in recent months. And the consumer, the user is seen as a consumer. But there are community networks that actually match many of those functions they provide. They're taken up because they're fit for purpose, because they've been designed with and by the community. They're governed open source. My microphone. Yes. They're governed open source, but I'm quite loud. So they're governed open source. The data is open data, and the user is a co-creator, so that it's continually being shaped to work for that community. So how can economic design promote community networks, not this corporate networks? I think we're in the moment, in the middle of what I would call Internet 2.0. And can we create Internet 3.0? I'll just carry on.
Can we wait? Sorry, can we wait just for the recording, because they won't get on the recording?
Okay, you can think. What would you do to improve community networks over corporate networks? I'm on again. I feel like a piece of AI enhanced software. Thank you. Okay. How can we promote community networks? First, recognize the commons. This little rational economic man is a character of us in the market space in the economy. We began economics with the market, and the character of humanity is the market. He's either labor or consumer, investor or debtor. But of course, we are so much richer than this in the household, the commons, and the state. We are makers, sharers, carers, co-creators, stewards, neighbors, partners, volunteers, protesters. And it's that full richness, the we of the commons, that actually creates the possibility of a community network. You can't have a community network unless you have people identifying as part of community. Second, opening up public spaces, and I'm sure you're aware of the work that Jeanette Sadiq Khan has done in New York to literally open up public spaces, both outside but also inside, turning public buildings that are no longer being used, deserted high street shops, into spaces where commoners can come together and meet and identify themselves as a group in the commons. Because you can only create a network if you've got nodes. You need nodes so they can connect. Become an open digital city like Barcelona. That is leaving behind the proprietary software, going open source, open design. And empowering platform cooperatives. So this is from Amsterdam. Gebied online means area online. And it's a very locally based little network. It does all the functions of a sort of Facebook group, but it's owned by the community, designed for the community. So you meet people. Interesting, you have to put your own face and your real name, and nobody's rude, because you might bump into that person buying carrots at the corner shop. So people are actually polite and respectful. You can meet people, organize events, create maps, initiatives, funding, projects, and it really builds dense community. And instead of trying to scale the one network, it spreads, popping up in lots and lots of little local networks. That classic difference between scale and spread. So, I think these two principles of distributive and regenerative design are key, and they're at the heart of my book. I would love at the end of this, if anyone in the room says, oh, fine, or if you disagree, great, if you disagree with others, or yes, but you've really missed 1, 2, 3, 4 other key design principles that we need if we're going to meet the needs of all people within the means of the planet. I would love to hear from you. If there are other design principles that have become so part of the way you work, they need to be there too. But I want to start towards closing by saying I think we are living in an extraordinary psychological drama between the 20th century extractive mindset and the 21st century generative mindset. You remember I said some enterprises say, well, the business is business is business. And others say, oh my God, this is what we're here for. To me, that captures the difference between the two. Because I think the 20th century in the space of enterprise was driven by one overriding question. You hear it underpinning most decisions and processes in 20th century corporate governance, which is how much financial value can we extract from the way we design this enterprise? And it's the shareholder value question, it's the fiduciary duty, it's the markets question that you hear on the financial news, you read in the financial papers. But when I talk to 21st century designers, whether they're urban designers or product designers or new business model designers, they're asking a completely different question, which is how many benefits can we generate in the way we design this enterprise? How many benefits? What could it do for the community, for culture, for the living world? What else could it give back? And we see ourselves as part of a cycle that if we know that if we give, then we will get back. And it's a mutual relationship. And of course we need financial benefits so that we can make enough profit that we open the doors next week, next year. But how many other benefits driven by that question? What is it that leaves some companies there in the 21st century while others have just jumped over here or founded themselves over here? And here I turn to the work of Marjorie Kelly, who is a brilliant corporate analyst. And she's identified what I call the 10 design traits, or the DNA traits of business, because how a business itself is designed hugely shapes what it can be and do in the world. And she talks about, firstly, purpose. What is the purpose of your enterprise? Ask a traditional car company your purpose, and they might say, well, we want to be the biggest sales of 4x4 in Europe. Or if you ask Open Motors what their purpose is to democratize mobility. The purpose of the Sanity toilet company is a safe and prosperous Kenya. A purpose way bigger than themselves, and they're just contributing to it through creating enterprise. What about how your enterprise is governed? What are the decision-making rules and the principles that drive the board meetings? What are the metrics by which staff are measured every week? I used to work with supermarket supply chains when I was working at Oxfam, and they were supermarkets say, you know, well, we want to buy fair standards with decent wages and ecological produce. But when you talk to the buyers, they say, well, I'm the buyer for bananas for this 6 months, and I'm kind of trying to get promoted. And every Monday morning I stand in a meeting with the buyer for oranges and apples and pears, and each of us has to report on last week. What were your sales? What were your profit margins? What was your market share? And if it's not growing, you're not the one who's going to get promoted. So are you holding your staff to very tight, narrow 20th century metrics, or going for a longer term? I met somebody from Triodos Bank the other day, which recently opened in the UK. It's a bank that invests in social environmental value with a fair financial return. The managing director told me that every Monday morning, the first 45 minutes of Monday morning is a whole staff meeting talking about the company's purpose. So embedding purpose in the way the company's governed. What about networks? How are you networked as an enterprise with your suppliers, with your customers, with your competitors? Can they be your allies? Are those networks that you're part of pulling you back to that 20th century extractive design, or is it actually enabling you to live out your 21st century values? And then going deeper, and I think the most powerful stuff lies the deepest. How is your enterprise owned? Because whether it's owned by a family, by its employees, its co-op members, by its customers, by private investors, or by shareholders, well, all this deeply shapes the finance and the quality of that finance. And whether that finance is after a short-term extractive return or long-term generative value. I think lots of companies are in what I would call the corporate split personality moment. And Unilever is a really good example that is very publicly in this split place. Unilever has, and its CEO, Paul Pullman, has an impressive purpose, the Sustainable Living Plan. It governs itself with a set of 69 metrics about cutting water, cutting carbon use, improving health, really guided by many of the aims to get into the donut. And it networks with progressive companies, it's part of progressive business alliances, it does research with Oxfam, it's hanging out in the right company. But it's owned by the stock market. And that means it's vulnerable to being pulled back by 20th century finance. Indeed, in February last year, you might remember that Unilever was open to a hostile takeover bid by financiers, venture capital, Kraft and 3G. Pulled back towards that 20th century mindset. So I think the 21st century generative possibilities for enterprise and designers working in those enterprises need to turn all those arrows in the same direction. We need ownership models that actually align finance behind social and environmental value as well as a fair financial return, because we need a generative century if we're going to have even half a chance of getting to the donut. And I want to leave you with what I think is the most interesting question as a designer. You know, design is disruptive. And I know that the donut image itself has been a disruptive design in the space of sustainability, in the space of business. And there's a real question of what is the responsible way of engaging if you're a disruptive designer? So let me share with you, as a last thought, a framework that I find incredibly useful. I discovered it since I finished writing my book, and I've become quite evangelical about it. It's called the 3 Horizons framework. So along this bottom axis is time, And going in that direction is what's prevalent, what's dominant in the world. And the idea is we want to see a transformation from a world of that extractive economy, the world we have where millions of people are falling short and we're overshooting the pressure on the planet, to could we reach a world where we actually meet the needs of all people coming back within the means of the planet? Well, in the present, way over there is always at least three qualities of the future that are visible. There's Horizon 1, business as usual. And that's what's dominant, so it's the big one, but it's, we believe or want, because this isn't prediction, this is aspiration, we believe it's no longer fit for purpose. I'm just going to call that mainstream capitalism or the extractive economic mindset. How much financial value can I extract from this? It's no longer fit for purpose, and so it's going to decline, and it needs to, and it should, but we want it to let go and leave well. Horizon 3 is the emerging future, the seeds of which are present. We can all point to, and I've shown you some examples of these generative enterprises that exist now. Sanergy toilets, Open Mocha cars, Houdini sportswear, the half housing. Small, they seem like small little fringe initiatives, but they are potentially the beginnings of a new future that we want to see actually rise up and become the dominant form of design and enterprise. But then for the really interesting horizon, and this is where you folks come in, the horizon of disruptive innovation. When things are changing, when you see that business as usual going down, the emerging futures coming up, well, that's a time of churn. And there's a lot of disruption that happens in churn. And disruption can be due to a new technology. It can be due to a political moment like Brexit. Brexit is a very disruptive event on the horizon. It can be due to an earthquake. And the question is, how does disruptive innovation play into either allowing business as usual to extend its life or bring through the emerging future? Let me give you one example. The little phone that's in everybody's pocket is a platform technology, digital platform. Just a technology. How does that disruptive technology play into the future? On the one hand, if it gets backed by very mainstream venture capital, it can get captured and you get Uber, right? You get all the exploitative relationships that have been dominant in the extractive mindset hooked onto a new technology to extend its life. And because it gets captured by business as usual, the emerging future, there's no energy left for emerging future to come through. And this is called H2 minus. Horizon 2, pull back into the old, extending the life of business as usual. But then there's a very different future where that technology is harnessed to bring through the generative future. In the city of Austin, Texas, Uber left because the city said, well, you need to meet our fingerprinting laws. And Uber said, don't want to do that, and they left town. And then they created a platform cooperative designed fit for taxi drivers, for the community, with social values embedded into the way they designed the app. Same technology, totally different kind of finance and design and purpose and governance and networks. And it brings through a very different future, H2+, because the disruption has been harnessed to bring through that future. So that's all it is, but I think this is profound stuff. Think about the emerging future that you want to see happen in the world. What is being born and how can we help it to arrive well? What's dying and how can we help it let go and leave well? And then crucially, as disruptors, as designers, how can you make sure that your disruptive designs are harnessed to bring through that future that you want to be part of, not captured by business as usual? And we can all think of many examples of really fantastic disruptive enterprises and technologies that get bought up by venture capital and then turned into a tool for extending the life of the old economy. And this is a question I'm personally really thinking about. I know that the donut economics and the donut design is a disruptive design and a disruptive idea. How do I need to responsibly engage? Who do I engage with? I'm being asked by big mainstream banks, "Ooh, come and do a project with us." Do I do that? Or how do you make sure you're not going to be captured, but that actually you're working with the future you want to create? So I pose that a question to yourselves to carry through your lives, actually. It's a question that is very live with me. What would it look like to come up with a set of criteria around collaboration so that we know that we are applying our disruptive design to bring through the future we want to see, not being captured by the one we're trying to let go and leave? So let me sum up. I shared with you a donut, the only one that's any good for us. This is the selfie of humanity, and I believe sincerely it's our generational challenge to turn this picture around, whether we are economists or journalists or designers or politicians or business leaders. We need to reinvent the way we work because no generation before us saw this. So why would we expect their models to be fit for the challenges it presents. I think regenerative and distributive design are key design principles for managing this complex adaptive system that is human society interacting with the living world. What else would you add? I've offered you a way of thinking about extractive enterprise and that psychological drama. I think we are in the middle, and it's going to take some decades, and it's painful. But I think we are moving from extractive to a generative mindset, and I think the way that enterprise is designed, or even an art school is designed, what's the purpose of the RCA? How is it governed? How is it networked? How is it owned? How is it financed? All of these things shape what any institution can be and do. And I find them very, very powerful questions to ask, because that shapes whether we are stuck in extractive or can move to generative. And lastly, if you're a disruptive designer and you're playing in that space of Horizon 2, disruptive innovation, how do you ensure that your work, who you work with, who you're financed by, how your work is owned, that it feeds into bringing through the future you want to see and doesn't end up being captured by the one that is desperately, through every power means it has, and it has a lot of power, to extend its life and stick around. I will leave you there. If you're interested in the ideas of donut economics, I had the privilege of working with some brilliant stop-motion animators. As you can see, they're silly, playful, funny, irreverent, trying to make economics accessible and fun for everybody. It has to be fun, transforming your economy. And we've got an online discussion space where people can come and join discussion communities and meet people who are asking and thinking and figuring out and inventing like themselves. But I will leave you where I began with the donut. And I really look forward to this conversation with John and then with all of you. Thank you very much indeed.
Fabulous stuff. My name is John Thackara, and I'm going to do a few minutes of questions to follow up with what we've had a very wide-ranging and exciting talk from Kate. But I won't spend too much time. I could do it for hours, but it's basically also for you to be part of this conversation. Even if we're in one of these traditional hierarchical settings. I wanted to ask you about this notion of what is being born amongst the new stuff, and that we are the first generation to know what the kind of challenges are, because I'm curious, and this is a group we're in an art and design institution where it's also as much about ways of being and perceiving things as it is about organizing them. So there's a long debate about whether designers should be organizing industry or just the products that come out of it. In your work so far, how are there other circumstances in which the key players change the way they value the world and their being in it, as well as you arguing rationally? To me, it's a very rational story and incredibly powerful, but is that enough? Do we not need to the way that people perceive of themselves in the kind of bigger picture?
So more than a rational story, but a deeper connection story.
You talked about value and values at certain moments, and my question is that we can either work out the best way to live on the planet in a responsible and kind of modern and 21st century way. At the same time, maybe it should be our basic core values that life is more important than money or something called the economy. So it's not an alternative, but it's to do with whether the values question of how we experience the world is also part of the change that's happening.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely true. I realise I suppose I had a very rational education in economics, and when I'd drawn the donut diagram, I realised how powerful pictures are, because so many people responded to it. And that drove me to ask, how? If pictures are so powerful, what are the pictures I was taught? And I went back to my textbooks and unearthed the pictures I'd been taught, and I realised I wanted to redraw those pictures. And the first time I drew them, I think they're in the lovely booklet that you've been handed, a sort of double page. I had an epiphany. I was sort of desperate writing my book, and I was thinking, oh, God, why did I take on this huge task? I don't know. I was really on the verge of giving up, and then I was sitting in a cafe one day and literally drew those two columns and had this epiphany that I was going to tell the stories of the book through images. And I sat there that day and had wonderful kind of clarity. I'm sure it was also the coffee, but, it gives you that instant high, and you think, I know what I'm doing, but it led me from there. But I also sat there thinking, well, these little icons that I've drawn, that's art. I mean, they look like kind of caveman stick art, right? This is the stick art or caveman art, or even the Platonic ideals of economics. But if that's one artistic way of representing these ideas, how else could it be done? And I was back in Zanzibar working with craftspeople. My secret other life, I was going to be a set designer, an opera set designer. So there's part of me that's always wanted to be an artist. So it was seeing their art and thinking, how else could this be done? What would it look like to do it in animations? I've worked with animators to do that. What would it look like if you knitted these different ways of thinking? What would it look like to dance the shift from mechanical equilibrium to dynamic complexity? To do it in photographs, to do it in stand-up comedy, to do it in puppetry. And one of the ways when I teach students about complex systems, the first thing I do is show them, we do it as a workshop, we move all the chairs and we make a system in the room, and there's one point we're all sitting on the floor, and then I play them a video of a murmuration of starlings. This wonderful one, you might know it's two women who were in Ireland on the River Shannon, and there was the world's most phenomenal starling murmuration overhead, and one of them happened to have a video camera. And someone set it to funky music. And all my students are sitting on the floor, about 30 of them, and it's playing on the wall, and they're watching this murmuration, but I'm watching them, because you can see them, they've shifted from their head, they're here, and they're going, ah. And I remember the first time I saw that, I thought, oh, that's the way to get someone to understand a complex system, to feel it, to see the beauty of it. And so, yes, the way I've described it in my book is quite rational, technical, but I really love finding ways to, how do you take somebody out of their little intellectual brain into the heart and go, wow, or into the belly and laugh, because I think those are two really great places where we learn and we enjoy learning. So yes, it's about values and not being afraid to speak about values.
So you showed some pictures of your life in the UN and in these big global organizations which operate in basically a rather rational way with processes and protocols and rules and so on. Have you shown a murmuration in those kind of contexts?
Oh, I would easily show a murmuration if I could go back now. Actually, my last day when I worked at the UN, the Human Development Report, for some reason, on my last day at their office, everybody else was out at a conference. And so I went down to the local paint shop and bought 3 cans of yellow paint, and I painted the entire conference room yellow. And that was my legacy. So yeah, I like being playful with big institutions. They love it. They love it.
They do, because they're in a prison. I mean, I don't know what your experience was, but I've kind of skirted around the edge of the world of policy. You talk about the mother tongue of policy. It's a kind of, it sounds a bit more cozy than it actually is, because there are tens, hundreds, maybe millions of people around the world who, so to speak, know there is a problem and write papers and do PhDs, and they go to gigantic conferences and nothing really seems to be happening. So that's why I was asking whether, in a sort of scale of 1 to 10, the rational approach of explaining to people what the problem is a task. It's not like a binary question, and enabling people to experience what the world is about as a living system, because that's what I think is missing from the rational side of the story.
Yes.
And have you got experience? Why can't you show murmurations to the policymakers?
Oh no, I could. I just haven't had the chance. I absolutely would and could. And I've become very playful. I call myself a renegade economist. It says that. So people are like, you're a bit weird. And I pull out hose pipes. And I've had large rooms of corporate CEOs looking like 6-year-old girls at their first ballet class, doing this. And people love it, actually. And when you can get people to laugh and to relax, I absolutely do, and I show them those videos and turn it into fun and talk about corporate psychotherapy, and I play with objects, and if you stop and look at the audience, the minute you pull out objects, like I sometimes talk about the difference between an iPhone and a Fairphone, I didn't today, but the minute you pull out objects, you suddenly see that everyone in the audience is kind of turned back into a 6-year-old kid at a puppet show, and they're like, what's going to happen next? And you think, okay, you're open, you're listening, make it playful.
But is it your experience that sometimes people at the top of big organizations, so to speak, get it and want to change but feel powerless, and that they don't know how to, running the UN or Procter & Gamble or Unilever you talked about, they're at the mercy of systems such as the market or the ideology of economics, and they lack the tools in their training to change things. So it's how you create the conditions for change is not in any MBA syllabus, not in the normal sense.
Yeah. So this diagram, go on. That one. let's put that one. So I was at a workshop with Unilever 6 months ago, and they invited about 30 people to say, what would a fantastic, sustainable company look like in 2030? They asked a lovely open question. It wasn't talk about us, it was talk about what would a hero company look like in 2030. Of course, all the women in the room said, excuse me, hero, hello, heroine or fantastic company. But so they had an open space. They said, if anybody wants to run a little workshop for 30 minutes in the coffee break, you can. So I immediately said, right, I'm going to run a corporate psychotherapy workshop, and there will be donuts. And so a bunch of them came along, and I drew that on a giant piece of paper. And I knew that we were going to have this opportunity. So I brought with me little objects. I brought a little twinkly heart. It was Christmas time. It was off my Christmas tree for purpose. I had a ruler for governance. How are you measuring yourself? I had a little web for networks. I had a bunch of keys for ownership, and I had some money for finance. I drew that on the table, and I put these objects. I said, all right, I'm going to tell you, Unilever, what I see from the outside. I see you've got, your heart is in the right place, you've got your metrics aligned, and you've got your networks, but the keys are in the extractive sector, and so is the money. That's what I see, and I see you're pulled in this two ways. If you want to speak, just pick up an object and talk to it or move it. So I set it up as a sort of game, and corporate therapy as well. And they just went, oh, yes, this is where we are. And it was a release. And to realize that, and I've learned this, when I worked at Oxfam, I did think, corporate people. I've learned that there are great people in every industry, and they're stuck in these designs that hold them back. And if we need to look at the design of the enterprise itself, this reveals why a CEO might say, I want to transform our company, but every quarter I have to show in my report to shareholders we've got growing sales, growing market share, growing profits. What am I going to do?
So my question is whether the question how to redesign the enterprise constrains one somewhat, because my favorite example of how redesigning companies, however much your good intentions, doesn't escape the reality is with IKEA, where I went to a meeting of their 200 sustainability managers, very passionate and expert people. 20 years they've been busy working on everything from, taking the air out of mattresses when they're being transported to taking a micron off the veneer on their furniture. And they have a list without end. The one thing they have not questioned in all those 20 years is the necessity for IKEA to grow. And so we had a 2-day meeting with me as an observer, very privileged to be in that situation. And at the end of the 2-day meeting, a senior executive from the main board of IKEA came and said, hi guys, thank you for doing this great work, and I've got some terrific news. We've just agreed the sort of 5-year plan of IKEA. We are going to double in size between now and 2020. So we have 650 million person visits now, 1.5 billion visits in 2020. And isn't that fantastic? And somebody said, well, do we have to grow like that? And she said, yes, of course we do. Otherwise, we can't make all the sustainability improvements that you're so constantly advocating. And there was a man there who was responsible for procuring wood for IKEA, which is like the 3rd largest user of wood in the world. And he said, yeah, well, at the moment, we're like 32% kind of sustainable or certified wood. I think that by 2020, we're certainly going to get up into the high 40s or maybe 50%. And so me not being very good with numbers said, but excuse me, but if the company is going to more than double in size by 2020, and then the sustainable wood is only at the most best case scenario 50%, you're going to be destroying more forests in 2020 than you are today. What does that mean for your strategy? It's not that they didn't answer, they just blanked out. Because the logic of growth is, so to speak, built into every part of the organization. That's a private company. So my question is, theoretically the market is, they don't have shareholder value laws telling them to do that. It's in the kind of mentality. How do you change that mentality?
Oh, I don't know. That's kind of corporate psychotherapy round 2. That has to go deeper. I don't know. That's a very interesting question, because the first question I was asked, how's a company owned? And it's usually the shareholder drive, but there it's private. And there is a deep cultural drive. Is it they're thinking, well, we're more sustainable than others, so we need to take that market share and displace them? Or are we actually trying to increase total sales overall? I don't know. Of course, it's much easier to be born into the regenerative design, right? Yeah. Like a company like Houdini, absolutely is born there and has designed itself to be there. But you were going to add something. How would you change them?
I think that the only sort of direction that has made sense to me, and 25 years have been utterly befuddled by this question, is if the value question is about place and a part of a territory in which living systems, including human beings, live, and that everybody in that place takes in some way or another collaborative responsibility for it, and that the interests of the company are subservient to the health of the place. And all the places, when you add them together, comes up to the planet, which is, I discovered very belatedly, how great many cultures in the global south think about their places now. Like the buen vivir concept in Latin America is that the living well is us living well, the land living well, and our place living well, and then in some way or another, that value system shapes the consequences and the changes they make as managers or parents or mayors or whatever. And we're not near that, I don't think. So it's how you break through, which, by the way, I think why it's great to be in this kind of environment. It's not, if we have the rational argument, it can't be argued with, and then we say, okay, how do we get from here to there? That's the next step.
Yeah, so I'll go back to the donut, because I think when I was at school, I never learned anything about how the planet works. I mean, I studied geography, but I never learned about these cycles of the living world, and that there was, that was in the 1980s. Maybe that's not fair, but today we know that much. And I think every child at school around the world learns the basics of human health. They learn the basic biology, 2 lungs, 1 heart, 2 kidneys, a liver. They learn about the digestive system, the nervous system. We learn that our temperatures, our body stabilizes. And then we know that health lies in enough but not too much, whether it's oxygen or water or food or exercise or heat or anything. It's about balance. And we deeply understand that. And I think every child in the world has the right to learn also about the planetary body, not just the human body, and to learn about the critical life-supporting systems that have been set out here, and to learn that health of the planet lies in remaining within that balance. And I think if a next generation of children have that deeper education, not just from a very technical diagram, but of course immersed in nature and experiencing it, seeing themselves as part of it, how can that help transform the mindset and the values? Now that's a long transformation. We don't have time
yes
to wait
and no,
for that.
Because I tell you the time, and I have no particular talent at science or anything else, but it was one lecture by one man, a 25-minute lecture in Battersea Town Hall, blew my mind in terms of the body and the planet being one thing. Stephen Harding from Schumacher College, who's written a book called Animate Earth, and he's not a kind of showman, he's just a serious systems thinking scientist, but a brilliant explainer. And he just explained how, the biomes, the bacteria in our body and the bacteria in plants, and everything is connected, including the things of a mineral quality as well as biological. Just explain. I think if he could teach me in 20 minutes, he could teach any child on the planet in probably 5 minutes. It's to do with how you get that kind of re-education happening, and also the kind of corporate people, what kind of experiences could we enable them to have, so that they say it's not just me against the kind of the market, but we're all in this together. That's the thing it's frustratingly near, but we're not there yet.
Great design challenge. What kind of games, experiences could you design for people stuck in that corporate situation to rise, to bring your whole self to work, and to actually be able to talk about values and interconnectedness in a way that corporate talk segments and separates?
Remind me what you wanted them to tell you before.
Well, I showed 2 design principles that I've put at the heart of donut economics. Instead of waiting for growth to even things up again, you've got to be distributed by design. Instead of believing that growth will clean up after itself, we need to create economies and businesses that are distributive by design and regenerative by design. So my whole book is framed around those 2, but I know there's more. I would just love to hear what other design principles have become second nature to people here.
Okay, so that's the challenge for you for part 2 is can you help Kate with design principles, just design practices that in one way or another could shift our focus from extracting value out of the planet to regenerating it. Any thoughts on that? Or other questions? Can you tell us who you are? I know, because then we can, yeah.
Well, I'm Nicolas, and I'm a tutor of the Service Design program. No, it's a kind of a question, or perhaps a contribution, I don't know, but
I was thinking, since you mentioned Piketty at the beginning, I was thinking, and all the questions are around basically the logic of IKEA. You were saying it's a private company, shareholders deciding around how to sustain growth.
Can you explain who Piketty is for the benefit of...
You mentioned
I
Piketty.
mentioned-
He wrote a very thick book, which everybody talked about, and I suspect not many people read. You probably read it, but can you summarize that in one sentence?
So, well, I was saying that Piketty's book showed that Kuznets's curve was correct, but Kuznets was looking at income distribution before and after the war. Piketty showed that actually the rich get richer and the poor don't catch up. And if the economy isn't growing fast enough to keep up with the rate of interest, then money ends up in fewer hands.
Thanks, brilliant.
And if that is the pace, it's possible to move towards the donut economy without capital redistribution. So if the ownership models are the way they are, the incentives around maximizing capital revenue are always going to be there. So my question is it possible that just through designing businesses in a different way and without, as Piketty said, without a tax on wealth or without understanding that these big companies that are ruling oral civilization, they still be owned by private people? So that's my question. Is that possible?
Fair question. Let me just click back because I can very usefully explain that in one slide. Here we are. So, Piketty says income inequality is getting really, really, really wide. So the wealth ownership is really wide and income inequality is really wide. And so the way to fix this is to have a big tax on the wealthy so it's redistributed. I think, and that idea of, if you wanted to tackle inequality, I think, I'm putting it very stylized here, the 20th century was focused on redistributing income and wealth. How do we redistribute? Well, how much should you tax the rich? How much should you give to the poor? And I think because of the disruptive technologies that we have and because we can redesign institutions, I want to go deeper, and I think we should pre-distribute the sources of wealth creation. So what are the sources of, what are the assets from which people generate wealth? First, health and education, right? It's the potential that lies in each individual, which is a very good reason why every person should have a claim to public, universal access, free at the point of service, health and education system. So here's to the NHS, which is 70 years old this week, I think, and to state schools in every country. Health and education, but also the ownership of housing, says here. So in London, right, what are these assets that the wealthy own? They own the houses of London, and they're making a very nice rent every week on that. How can you have more distributive ownership of housing? How can you have more distributive ownership of energy systems? For the first time in human history, each house can have its own mini power station instead of paying a large bill. How can you have more distributive ownership of information? 20th century was all about controlling it through intellectual property rights, patents, and copyright. 21st century has the Creative Commons licensing. So actually, exactly this question, I was trying to get it through here, and through enterprise. 20th century, you're a labor, we pay you a wage, and then the value that's actually generated through the company goes to shareholders. 21st century, the rediscovery of cooperatives, the possibilities of employee ownership. So actually, for me, this is my answer to Piketty. I wouldn't only go for redistributing through tax, because you've got to negotiate that. If you're the poor, you are negotiating against power every electoral cycle to get enough redistributed. This actually redistributes the very sources of wealth creation. And to me, that's a far more exciting enterprise.
Another possibility is that you redefine what value and wealth means so that even though the rich have lots of money and houses, they don't necessarily have lots of other forms of value that exist in the living world. And my question is whether by confronting, for example, who owns all the houses, that, so to speak, leaves the discussion about progress in the possession of houses or the possession of money. But what you talked about the household economy and the role of women. There's also the role of... I just want to tell you a quick story about when I was in Kerala 3 years ago, and we were discussing elder care with some people who were staying, and the man who ran the inn that we were staying in, he said, "Excuse me, what is elder care?" And we said, because there was me and some Americans. And they said, that's where you put your parents when they're too old to live at home. He said, you're joking. And he could not, he said, what do you mean you put them away? Don't they come and live with you? I said, no, we're too busy. We have jobs and children and we have life to lead. He literally couldn't understand what I was saying the words just didn't register in his head. And we're talking about probably, 80% of the population of the world, the concept of elder care that you pay for or do somewhere else doesn't make any sense. So he is a poor innkeeper in the south of India with probably, earns $300-400 a month, but his wealth is that his parents don't have to think who's going to look after them, and he knows his children will look after him without any sort of systems of care and welfare being put into place. So I'm just wondering whether there's a kind of rebalancing can be done in how we describe wealth, as well as distributing the kind of money wealth.
Yeah, and of course in that situation, I don't know him and his situation, but I'm going to guess it's his wife and his daughters who do that elder care. So it's about the gender politics as well of the unpaid household. So that's a really important question. How do you redistribute unpaid caring work in the household? So countries in Scandinavia are ahead on this. First of all, they have, for example, not about elder care, but child care of infants, parental leave, not just maternity leave, but parental leave, and basically you get 18 months, and one partner can take up to a year, but then if you want the whole 18 months, the other partner has to take it. And then so you can have it in law, and then you have to have it in culture, because of course sometimes these laws are introduced where men can take up to 6 months, paternity leave. It's like, ooh, that makes it look like I'm not really committed to my job. So you need a cultural shift as well. So there's all sorts of nuances of power relationships and balance between gender and generations. And there's no one way of organising this. There's no one society. Of course, my parents, personally, they having grown up in this far more atomised and nuclear household, we talk about it sometimes. My mum says, oh, I wouldn't want to come and live with you. No, I would want... So there's a cultural norm as well that emerges over time. I think all these things are continually shifting, and I think that place I showed of the Lilac, the Leeds, that little community, I can imagine actually elder people living in those kinds of communities, and of course there are many experiments, older people living next door to students and having that co-caring relationship. So different setups of this that doesn't put it all back in women's unpaid care work in the household.
But I was very struck by you saying making visible things that are either invisible or we take for granted. Has anybody here been triggered by that to think, yes, I can do that. I'm a designer, I'm an artist.
Oh, yes.
You can make us aware of things that are already there but we've forgotten about or left to one side or have been distracted from. Does anybody feel a calling after that?
While you think about that, I will say one of my greatest moments of pleasures of writing this book was when I got to work with a graphic designer to turn my little scritchy sketches into beautiful, iconic 21st century diagrams, because it really does matter. And they have to be lovely and people have to want to use them. So, yeah.
Hi, name's John. I'm an illustrator. I tried to do that with a kind of satirical sketch I did of a human trying to recreate a beaver dam, trying to show the futility of us destroying animals in the environment which actually help protect us and which actually help improves the sustainability of the planet, and then showing like the work the person has to do individually to replicate the individual beaver dam, and showing how the destruction of our planet is actually our own shortfalling, and how we just have this anthropic glaze which tries to plaster over the cracks that we make. And it's always this really quick fix that we try to impose, but we just don't understand the nuances that we just can't replicate. So yeah, that's how I use drawing to do that kind of thing.
You said I tried to do that. Did you feel that? Why did you use that word?
Probably because I'm a bit self-deprecating.
Okay.
I think I've had this discussion with designers and artists for 20 years, is that there's a difference between making a very brilliant communication artifact with all sorts of good or bad intentions, and that having a good effect on the context in which it's used. And Alan Alda, the comedian and the actor, he said, it doesn't matter what you say or what medium you use, it's what people hear or see that matters. And I think that's the kind of missing bit in our education collectively. I'm a writer, it's the same for me. I spent 25 years saying, you mustn't do this, you bad people, which mysteriously they then say, go away, or they just switch off. So it's how you engage people using communication skills of different kinds so that things remain open and people keep talking. So that's what and that's very tough, because I think we're all inclined to kind of cast judgment on the other person, me, I know. So to say, how do you use communication or art to create conversations without necessarily controlling the outcome, that's, I think, hard. But something this kind of community can do very well, I think. Anything else? Yes, madam.
Somewhat along those lines.
Can you tell us your name? I'm sorry.
I'm Janaki, and I'm an IDE here, student here. You're talking about using the beauty of diagrams and the wonder of objects and the joy of moving in space to convince people in their hearts and in their guts. And I'm wondering if you're talking to decision makers and they're moved by what feels like a primary experience like that, how do they communicate that to other decision makers and make change that way? Do they then have to be intellectual again?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't know. I do get contacted by quite a few people, either by Twitter or email, something, and people who've had a kind of that moment of epiphany of this just really changed the way I think, or it really visualized the way I've always thought. So many people, when I first drew the donut diagram, I knew it was powerful before it was fully published, because so many people would say, I've always thought of sustainable development like this, I've just never seen the picture before. It was like, this makes common sense and I've never seen it before. And to me, whenever I hear that, I think, okay, this is a powerful idea, because you're visualizing something that people have wanted to articulate, and you're giving them the word or the picture. So people do have that response. I mean, of course, they can share the image, and I tried to, the way I'm trying to, so I'm an advocate. I wrote this book as an act of advocacy, right? I left my job at Oxfam to do what I thought was the most effective advocacy I could do, which was to write a book. And so having published it a year ago, I'm now thinking, how do I responsibly and effectively be an advocate of this? And I'm spending a lot of time going around presenting, and I love talking to different communities. So when Becky came up to me after the LSE talk and said, I'm at the RCA, I was like, yes, because I've learned it's all about design and I want to come and talk with this community. But then how do you then empower others to go and take it? So one of my principles is try and enable your ideas to work even while you're asleep, so that you don't become a bottleneck. So that's why I've put a lot of effort into videos and animations, so that people can see it, and also you don't have to read the book, you can get it for free, and it's online, you can get it in 7 minutes. So people can show those videos, but for what the next stage of work that I want to do now is say, okay, I know that I've been approached by different communities who say, we want to use this in our work. So educators in like A-level economics teachers, or people in universities across subjects, cities and places that say we want to use the donut, like the guys in Sweden, businesses that say how can this help us think about our strategy, politics. I've been amazed by the number of politicians across the political spectrum who've wanted to engage, and I want to work and create tools that are useful to those different communities, precisely so that when one person finds it, whether it's a teacher or somebody in a company, there is an online resource that they can pick up and use and take and work and do a workshop in their company and ask these questions and put this on the table and turn it into a game. So I'm just at the stage of trying to figure out how to do that really well, which of course is a design question, so that other people feel empowered to multiply it and spread it.
Somebody at the back? Thanks.
You're welcome.
Hello, I'm Beatrice. I work with arts and cultural organisations to think about how we can tackle some of the challenges today. I wanted to ask a question about time frames. You talk about 20th century, 21st century. Do you think beyond that? I'm doing an inquiry at the moment with a multidisciplinary group who are thinking about the far future, sort of many generations from today, and how we might have a longer sense of now or time, and therefore have more responsibility for what's coming in the future.
Okay, so my partner, who some of you may know, is called Roman Krznaric, and he wrote a book on empathy. And I know he's given talks at the RCA before. He's now writing a book on long-term thinking. So every night I find myself lying in bed next to somebody who's thinking about long-term thinking all the time. So I definitely want to put you in contact with him, number one. I didn't draw this or write my book with a really long-term thinking, but I'm deeply inspired, and I know John is, because I've seen her name in his book, by a woman called Janine Benyus, who is a biomimicry thinker. And actually, if any of you sort of need that bit of boost of inspiration, just watch a video by Janine Benyus. She studied biology and English literature at university, and you can feel it, because she just understands the living world, and then she writes it in poetry. And she talks about, there's a wonderful video, if you really want to watch, 20-minute video, it's on Tree TV, Janine Benyus, just Google that. And towards the end of this video, she says, you know, nature's organisms, whether it's a bird or a worm or a meerkat, it can it can look after its young. But we don't just want to look after our young, we want to look after the young of our young, of our young, of our young. You can't be here to look after your offspring in 10,000 generations. So all that you can do is now, in place, create conditions that are conducive to life. And that gives your offspring the greatest chance of thriving. And I love that language, and she talks about creating conditions that are conducive to life. And what is it that, what kind of conditions in this place, and that goes back to the specificity of place that John was talking about, what is it that's conducive to life here? I hadn't heard that language when I was writing my book, but when I look at the planetary boundaries framework in a very scientific, rational, split into 9 little segments sort of way, it's the closest I've ever seen of Earth system science saying, we believe that these are the critical life-supporting systems that are conducive to life that has been living in the last 11,000 years. We call it the Holocene. We, Homo sapiens, are part of it, as are all other mammals and organisms and worms and birds and insects that are co-dwellers on planet Earth with us in this epoch of the planet. So if we want to think about the very, very long term, the best we can do is create conditions conducive to life. Now, I have to slightly spoil that story by saying that Earth systems, the reason that Earth has been in this very stable, benevolent phase, because things normally spike, it's not happened for 400,000 years. And the reason is that we're swinging around the sun in a slightly odd elliptical way. And that's, if we didn't disrupt the Earth system, that would be expected to last for another 30 to 50,000 years. So if you've got ambitions beyond 30 to 50,000 years, and go for it, then we'd need to think of another solution or something else, another adaptation, because Earth is not going to keep swinging this way. The Holocene phase wouldn't last forever. The problem is we're kicking ourselves out of the Holocene phase by transforming the conditions of life on Earth.
But I want to say that if you want to figure out how to think in multiple time frames, that's something that artists can help you do. Because I'll give you 2 examples. So the Schumacher College, they have a practice called the Deep Time Walk, which is, again, one of these very remarkable combinations of scientists and artists saying, how do we get people to think in geological time rather than just in economic time or in when's the next drink time? And anyway, just look up Deep Time Walk and you will see a very remarkable exploration which is ongoing called How Do We Think in Different Time Scales? And it's scientists and artists talking together with no kind of fixed thing, but there is an app, unbelievably, but there's also, you know, mystical and spiritual moments of practice and so on. Example 1. Example 2, there's a group called Encounters Arts who purpose in life is, and they're all basically women with 30 years experience in different ways of public performance and public art. How do we get people to start talking about these difficult questions in a way that's not confrontational and isn't about making everybody feel guilty? Answer, well, it's difficult, but if you make the question like that, then it's actually, that's a good task. So they have a practice called the art of invitation, which is lots of different ways, actually, of getting people to have these very tough and challenging discussions without either becoming confrontational or without going into kind of automatic speak mode, like I would do, or without, disappearing into the back of the room in fear. So it's all about embracing divergent and diverse voices. Anyway, just look up the art of invitation and Encounters Arts, because I think that sort of work is really, that can be transformational. It's not recipes, but it's just saying, to answer your question, how do we think in multiple timescales? Brilliant question. Lots of possible half-formed answers, I think. So, is there somebody else? I have terrible eyesight. One there, okay. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Andrea. So to go back to the short and medium term, obviously it's amazing and inspiring to think about what individuals, companies and the commons could do to move to that safe and just space of the donut. But obviously politics is a very different beast, and it's usually 20 to 30 years behind what people actually think. So what do you think is the best possible next step? So how can we move from GDP calculation to a slightly better metric to try and improve and take a step forward? Because it's unlikely the politicians are going to move from calculating GDP to having a donut-shaped dashboard to show to the country. So what do you think in realistic terms in the short term
that could be a decent next step.
Okay, you said that politics is often 20 to 30 years behind. For me, the tragedy is that economics as a discipline, I think, is at least 100 years behind. The diagram I showed of the circular flow, that was drawn 70 years ago by Paul Samuelson, and it's still the biggest diagram. So that's my bugbear. And what chance do students have if they're being taught a mindset that was drawn up in the 1950s of coming up with policies fit for the 2050s? But you're asking me a very specific question, how do you replace GDP? Well, actually, I'm going to I don't want to be incremental. And I think that there's enough people working in that space who are being incremental. And if you go for something incremental, you'll get half of what you're aiming for. So I like to go for the complete reframe. And I would say, actually, yeah. And I often say to politicians, they say, well, we want to talk about growth or not growth. I say, no, the ultimate metric of whether or not this country is doing well will be if politicians were to stand up every year in Parliament on giving a state of the nation and reporting on the progress your politics has made, your party policies, against the social foundation, meeting the health, education, housing, political voice, gender, equality needs of all people, and how you're moving back within planetary boundaries. And in fact, the researchers at the University of Leeds have already created a website. I didn't show it to you, but if you go goodlife.leeds.act.uk, there's a wonderful website. They made 150 national donuts. So I can already show politicians, we've already made the donut for you, don't worry, we've got it. And this is where your nation is on that scale. So actually, I think we are moving to dashboards, and I'll end this response now. As you can tell, I like speaking in big stylized swings from the 20th to the 21st. I think the 20th century was dominated by the metric of money. GDP, this single monetary metric of a nation's output, was created in the 1930s by Simon Kuznets by the request of Congress. He created it. He said, but I wouldn't use it. Oh, too late. It was used as the metric. We became obsessed with it. By 1961, the OECD was founded with its constitution aiming for the highest sustainable rate of growth, not sustainability, but highest sustained rate of growth. It became the overriding target. I think we are now at the end, seeing people at the end of almost perfecting the era of the monetary metric. So now some people's job is to price the value of ecosystem services provided by pollinators. Bee pollination is worth £43 million a year, or to value natural capital. So if we put a price on everything, somehow it will all get incorporated. But I think that's like perfecting the dying metric, like that H1 horizon is the monetary metric. I think a new future is coming through where the 21st century we will measure the world and human well-being in natural and social metrics. We will measure nature in her own language, in parts per million of carbon dioxide, in the nitrogen cycle, in the existence of species, in the water cycle. So we'll understand, and it'll be complex and multiple metrics. And we have to learn that. Just like when we drive a car, we're looking at a dashboard with multiple metrics. Nobody wants one dial with it all mushed in together in a car. And we'll measure human well-being in social metrics. And the Sustainable Development Goals are evidence that we're moving that way already. So actually, I think this is the century of dashboard data, natural and social metrics. And the beautiful thing is, this is the era of big data. We're going to have the Internet of Things. We're going to have the Internet of living things almost in real time. So technology is on our side for doing this.
Totally, I want to confirm that, if anybody wants to say, but I think we've all been struggling through, 20, 30 years of incrementalism, doing less harm when the basic logic is to grow, and then you end up doing more harm. When you do less harm, but the economy has to grow, you do more harm. I think a lot of people, in a lot of different ways, are saying enough with incrementalism. And there's another resource, if you think that this is just wishful thinking or magical thinking, there's a group called Rapid Transition has been set up as a research group with Andrew Sims and Peter Newell, saying, by the way, we've done very radical changes in the past when we had to. Everything from reducing private vehicle transport by 95% during World War II. There are 900 community, which you were talking about, energy companies in Germany from very few 15 years ago. And this project is filled with known historical examples of very profound change that happened when it had to happen. And I think with more and more people saying, well, it has to happen now, very obviously, but it's not a cause for despair, it's a cause for optimism, because we've done it before and we can do it again, and therefore that's very likely to be happening, I think. Do we need to stop now, Becky? How are we doing? Okay, let's keep going. Couple. Please, yeah.
Hey, I'm Linda, and I work in central government trying to help local authorities to move towards kind of open standards for their city services. Very beginning of a journey, hasn't been much openness to doing this stuff.
Could you say, if you work for central government, you're trying to connect with municipalities around the country, in the UK? Or?
So working in central government, setting up a very new thing, a small unit that is trying to identify common local digital transformation aspirations, and help figure out how you get them to move towards kind of distributed design, common approaches to delivering their services, and really importantly, open standard technology. So it kind of goes back to this man's question about how you kind of make the case in the interim. So totally take a point about, revolution, not evolution would be the way the government digital speak for what we're also aspiring to. And I took a lot of inspiration from your circular economy metaphors for what we're trying to do ourselves. And my problem is always making a business case, because finance is really they get you, they want to help you, but they're just but I need a benefits realization plan, how your investment in whatever, because obviously we couldn't possibly have any money spent, but will return to the taxpayer. So I would love guidance on examples from economists where they have made, and it's always a bit makey-uppy, we think that if we are able to enable this kind of distributed innovation to happen where everyone's abiding by open standards, we can create wealth. We're not just eliminating income and that kind of thing. So any guidance on that, I think we could adapt and use for our own purposes.
Great that you're here, because I'm just talking about it, but you're actually doing it, and that's fantastic. I just want to say that what you just said is, we've got all these wonderful ideas of open, but finance says, where's the business case? You are living this psychological drama, and the way it's framed is lovely ideas, but where's your business case? Come back. Come back when you've got a business case. It's your problem. You're lacking something, which is a business case. You're pointing to this generative, right? But you're still talking to a finance department because of the models that's used or the way that finance is framed that is stuck in extractive, that it wants this financial return. It's not counting the social environmental value, and it's your problem. You come back when you can make it. And I even talked to Janine Benyus, and she's experiencing this. She told me she was helping design biomimicry into urban buildings for a developer who said they wanted to embed biomimicry in their design. She said, we can create apartment buildings that draw in the dirty city air, that filter it, put it through the building. Before it goes out, they filter it again, so you're putting clean air back into the city, she said with a smile. And the developer said, but why would I do that? And it's this split. Right, so number one, it's not your problem. You're standing in a generative space. The problem is you're working in an organization where the finance is still pointing at this extractive. So number two, okay, but every day it feels like your problem because you've still got to win these guys over. I was just in Denmark, and they were telling me that they had just managed to build into the economy's macroeconomic model the idea of dynamic returns. So if you invest in something, let's count in the positive externalities that will actually come back in the long run. For example, the wind power, a government might say, well, we have a responsibility to our taxpayers, and today wind power might cost more, so we can't make that investment in all our transport and hospitals and schools. But then if you build in the dynamic argument, yes, but if a large procurer like a government buys wind power, you know what it's going to do? It's going to bring the cost down for everybody over time, so it's going to have a positive dynamic benefit. So that's just one very practical example I heard, and they were delighted in Denmark that this dynamic effect, which sounds bloody obvious when you say it like this, but it would just been recognised that this could be built into the macroeconomic model. But I would point you towards folks who are doing this, because I know there are people who, you're so not alone in that question, but there are people who are figuring out how to not just make the business case, but get business to see the life case. That's what I want. You'd say to the finance department, you come back to me when you've got a life case for your business model.
Can I just say that I actually do think I have agency. I have the ear of finance, and they really want to give me money. They don't really. Please don't tweet me. But we're making the case for help in this. And if I just had a few examples, even if they are kind of tangential, for how distributed, open standard kind of innovation can actually return. There are economists, I'm sure, doing creative thinking about this, and if there was a way to surface that, you could share it with people like me, and we would try, because we are your advocates on the inside, like we would like to use that information, and maybe I'm going to try and hire an economist actually to help make these cases.
Brilliant.
If you know anyone good, please let me know.
Okay.
I think we should probably draw things to a close, just to take a bit more weight off those of you struggling to figure out what is the case for the donut economics. I think case making is one type of change. You make an argument which is irrefutable and is backed up by evidence. The other way to think of it, a parallel way and not an alternative, which is where I think, again, art and design has a role to play, is under what circumstances can change unfold under its own sort of dynamic because of life. And so, in other words, what are the enabling conditions for change? And in Latin America, they talk about life plans, which is not about plans as in arguments and data and evidence, but making sure that the children are educated, that the corporate people, the political people understand that life is more important than money. And I just think that we can, that's another way to contribute to this change that we all want to see, is enabling conditions so that people can change in lots of different ways. I think that's very powerful.
Yes.
But any final points, or shall we draw things? Do we need to, can I just thank the college and Becky and her colleagues and the faculty for inviting us? It's been great. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. The whole SustainLab really hope that this gave you ideas and lots of inspiration. Please keep in touch with the SustainLab. It will keep going next year. Graduating students, please come and have talks with us. First years, please get involved. And the whole SustainLab would like to say a big thank you to Becky for the whole year. For organizing everything. And ladies, and everyone will be moving to the Service Design Studios for drinks. Please join us. And thank you again for coming. It was our pleasure to have you.
Thank you.